we were known in the rest of the world, part of the industry, as a family. People used to say, if you go to Bray, you'll enjoy it, because we were a family there. An excellent canteen, excellent facilities and nice people.
A lady called Mrs. Thompson ran the catering at the studio with all her band of helpers, and there was a restaurant for the execs, the producers and the stars, and then there was the canteen for mostly for the workers, and most people ate in the canteen because it was cheaper. Just occasionally on a birthday we would go into the restaurant and pay the pound and sit with the stars, and I just thought that was lovely.
Now Mrs. Thompson, she was our guardian angel. She was the one who provided us in the mornings with our bacon butties and egg sandwiches and roast potatoes warmed off from the day before. You know, wonderful.
The best canteen in the world. I was given notes at the end asking me not to eat any more of the treacle pudding with custard and cream because it was showing on the hips and the costumes were getting tight. It was to die for, I can't tell you. Wonderful meals.
So many wonderful stories are told about Bray that I think it now qualifies as one of Britain's legendary film studios. And although its memory is now revered, Hammer's management in London took a very different view of it at the time. They were a pragmatic bunch, and by the early 1960s they'd come to regard it as something of a millstone. They particularly resented having to keep 130 people in full employment, even when there wasn't a film in production. So by the mid-1960s, Bray was being mothballed in production, and many of its staff were freelance.
I eventually finished working for Hammer, I think it was 64, 65, at which point Hammer had to let me go, amongst many others, because things were changing for them. They weren't having as much production work coming in as they would like, and had to let a lot of contract staff go, and I eventually had to go as well. And I went freelance, and I would come back to do the occasional picture for Hammer Films as a second assistant director.
There was an added problem. Not only was Bray very expensive to run, but also it was beginning to look a bit pokey, a bit small. I think audiences, and Hammer were acutely conscious of this, audiences wanted their films to be bigger by the mid-60s. You know, they'd seen, just take one example, they'd seen these massive, sprawling James Bond films by that stage, and Bray was a small facility, and the two Gothic horrors that they made in 1966, Frankenstein Created Woman and The Mummy's Shroud, were beginning to look a bit pokey again. The little bit of pokiness that you were conscious of in The Curse of Frankenstein 10 years before was now becoming a bit of a liability, and the critic Robert Robinson very cruelly pointed out the fact that in Frankenstein Created Woman, Frankenstein's laboratory involves just a lot of stuff which to him looked like jam-making equipment. And in The Mummy's Shroud, they try to reproduce an Egyptian village on the lot at Bray, and it's quite an impressive Egyptian village, but it's very small. It's just a few little narrow alleyways here and there, and there's not a lot of room for manoeuvre.
The story of Hammer and Bray effectively came to an end in 1966. Hammer were in the middle of a British distribution deal with ABPC, and they had their own facility, Elstree Studios, and they had their own staff that they had to keep in full-time employment. So one of the conditions of the distribution deal was that Hammer should use Elstree whenever possible. By 1966, there just weren't enough opportunities to use Bray anymore, so at the end of the year, Hammer closed it.
When Hammer decided to leave Bray, it became quite a shock to most of the workforce, i.e. ourselves. Why is this happening? I mean, there was no reference made to any reasons. I was not aware fully of what problems were facing the company at all at that point.
The Mummy's Shroud finished shooting on the 21st of October, and Hammer formally moved out a month later on the 19th of November. And it was very much the end of an era. Their films would never look quite the same again. But by the same token, their films couldn't feasibly be made at Bray anymore. I mean, early in '67, they went to MGM Boreham Wood, which of course was a huge facility, to make Quatermass in the Pit. And that's a very big subject, Quatermass in the Pit. Could one imagine Quatermass in the Pit looking anything like the way it does had it been made in Bray Studios? It absolutely wouldn't.
I made a couple more films for Hammer, Love Thy Neighbour and Man About the House. The only difference is we didn't make them at Bray, we made them at Elstree. One was like a factory. I mean, rows and rows and rows of studios and everything, as opposed to Bray. And I'd be perfectly honest, until today, I had no idea that these were made for Hammer.
Bernard didn't like work at Elstree. And when he didn't work at Elstree, when he was in between films, he would wake up in the morning and say very cosily, "Oh, not go to Elstree." And so happy not to go to Elstree.
When we left Bray and had to go to Elstree and Pinewood, I hated it. Hated it. It was known as, I think, ABPC then. It lost the atmosphere and the feeling and the closeness that we'd had at Bray. It was gone.
I'm very sentimental and about nostalgic about those Bray days. And whenever I have to talk about them or see books mentioning them, I'm just very moved.
The sadness of it all coming to an end, as things do, you have to get over it and move on. Sometimes it's easy or easier than others, and some people find it easy and other people not so easy. But in my particular case, it wasn't that easy. I did miss it and still do. Now in my 82nd year, still remembering or trying to remember 40 years ago, it in itself is a job, but a pleasant one, because I had such a good time.
I worked at Bray Studios for 12 years. I loved my job, made several jobs I had there, finishing with script supervisor. But the most memorable thing for me would be that I met Hugh, working with him and then loving him and marrying him in the end, and, you know, having a family. I will always be grateful to Bray and Hammer for introducing me to my future husband.
I remember the wedding day. Do you remember all the cards and telegrams that used to came in and read out at the reception?
And the two one from Michael Crows and one from Tony Hines.
Yes.
Do you recall?
I can't remember Michael's too much, but I remember Tony Hines. Words similar like, "May your friendship and your love continue in happiness, and the direction and the continuity be there forever."
Yeah, that was lovely. That was very nice,
Yeah.
wasn't it?
So here we go.